They called him Pastor Silas Thorne, the holiest man in Louisiana, a preacher who built his fortune preaching God's order while chaining hundreds beneath his chapel. His sermons echoed across Eden Hill, the grandest plantation in the South. White pillars, golden crosses, and secrets buried under every prayer. And among those listening was Isaiah Cole, a quiet carpenter with steady hands and a fire he tried his whole life to hide. He once believed Silas's words until the pastor took something from him that no sermon could forgive. That night, thunder rolled, and Isaiah lit a match. By dawn, the largest plantation in the parish was nothing but smoke and screams. But the pastor didn't die in the fire. He rose from the ashes, calling it God's punishment, turning himself into a martyr, and Isaiah into the devil. Now, hunted, haunted, and driven by guilt, Isaiah must finish what the flames began, burn not just the man, but the lie that made him untouchable. Because sometimes, to cleanse a holy man's sin, you have to set fire to his heaven. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning air hung thick and wet over Eden Hill Plantation, the kind of Louisiana heat that made a man's shirt cling to his back before the sun fully crested the tree line. Mist rose from the cotton fields in pale sheets, turning the rows of white bowls into something ghostly, something that might disappear if you looked away too long. But the chapel stood solid against it all, whitewashed boards gleaming like bone, its steeple piercing the gray sky with the certainty of a promise or a threat. Isaiah Cole stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, his calloused hands folded before him, his face a mask of careful neutrality. Around him, bodies pressed close, field hands still smelling of yesterday's labor, house servants in their Sunday clothes, and scattered among them like drops of oil in water, the white families who owned the land and everything that walked upon it. All of them had come to hear Pastor Silas Thorne speak. The chapel doors stood open wide, and from within came the voice, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." Pastor Thorne's words rolled out like thunder, each syllable carefully shaped, perfectly timed. His voice was a weapon he had spent years sharpening. For this is the order God Himself established. This is the divine hierarchy that separates man from beast, that brings light into darkness. Isaiah watched him through the doorway. Pastor Silas Thorne stood behind a simple wooden pulpit, one Isaiah himself had built 2 winters ago. But there was nothing simple about the man who commanded it. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair like veins of precious metal, Silas moved with the grace of someone who had never once doubted his right to occupy space. His black coat was perfectly pressed. His collar gleamed white as his chapel walls. When he raised his hands, the congregation leaned forward as if pulled by invisible strings. "Some among you question this order," Silas continued, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "Some whisper in the darkness that God's design is unjust. But I say unto you, who are you to question the Almighty? Did you paint the stars? Did you breathe life into Adam's clay?" He paused, letting silence do its work. "No, you did not, and so you must trust in His wisdom, even when your weak flesh rebels against it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the white families seated in the front pews. Behind them, pressed into the standing room, the enslaved people of Eden Hill made no sound at all. They knew better. Isaiah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had heard this sermon before, in a dozen different forms. The words changed, but the meaning never did. Stay where you are. Accept your chains. Call it holy. He studied the pastor's face, looking for something. Doubt, shame, the smallest crack in that perfect mask. But Silas Thorne showed nothing except absolute conviction. He believed every word he spoke. That was what made him dangerous. "Let us pray," Silas said, bowing his head. The congregation followed. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for the order you have bestowed upon us. We thank you for making clear the path of righteousness, for showing us that obedience, true obedience, is the highest form of love." Isaiah did not close his eyes. Instead, he watched a bead of sweat trace down the pastor's temple, watched the way Silas's fingers gripped the pulpit edge with casual ownership. Those same hands had baptized children. Those same hands had signed bills of sale. Isaiah had seen both, sometimes within the same week. The prayer ended. The congregation lifted their heads like flowers turning toward sun. Silas smiled, warm, paternal, absolutely sincere. "Before we depart," he said, his voice softening, "I wish to perform a blessing. Sarah, bring forth the child." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her Sunday dress faded but clean, her arms cradling a bundle wrapped in worn linen. She moved with the careful steps of someone walking through a dream they did not trust. When she reached the front, Silas descended from the pulpit and placed one hand gently on the infant's head. "What is the child's name?" he asked. "Grace, sir," Sarah whispered. "Her name is Grace. How fitting." Silas looked out at the congregation. Grace, God's unmerited favor. His love poured out upon us, though we are unworthy. He closed his eyes. "Lord, bless this child. Keep her in your light. Guide her steps along the path you have chosen for her. May she grow in faith and in obedience, and may she always remember that your ways are higher than our ways, your thoughts higher than our thoughts." "Amen. Amen," the congregation echoed. Sarah's face crumpled with relief or grief. Isaiah could not tell which. She clutched the baby tighter and hurried back into the crowd. Silas watched her go with the same benevolent expression he wore when counting the Sunday collection. The service ended. The White families filed out first, shaking Silas's hand, praising his wisdom, his eloquence, his godliness. The enslaved people waited until given permission to leave, then dispersed quickly, silently, like smoke. Isaiah returned to his small workshop behind the main house as the sun climbed higher and burned away the morning mist. He had carpentry to finish. A new desk for Silas's study, oak with brass fittings. His hands moved through the familiar motions automatically, while his mind worked elsewhere. He had just begun planning the joinery when he heard voices outside. Two of the overseers, talking carelessly as they passed. "Shame about Sarah's baby," one said. "Pastor says it's for the best. Girl's got field hand's blood. Better she goes to a house that needs a nursemaid. Besides, we're getting top dollar. Louisiana families pay well for young stock. When's the sale?" "Dawn. Wagon comes at first light." Their voices faded. Isaiah's hands had stopped moving. The chisel rested against wood, its edge pressed into grain but not cutting. He stood very still, listening to the silence that followed their words. That night, long after the plantation had gone dark, Isaiah sat alone in his workshop. A single candle burned on his workbench, throwing shadows that climbed the walls like reaching hands. He had laid out his tools with the same precision he always used. Saws arranged by size, chisels in perfect rows, his measuring square forming a right angle against the wood grain. He picked up a plane and turned it in his hands, feeling its weight, its balance. He had made this tool himself years ago, shaped it to fit his palm exactly. Good tools lasted. They outlived the hands that made them. They could build, or they could destroy, depending on who held them. Through the workshop's small window, he could see the chapel in the distance, its white walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. Beautiful, pristine, a monument to faith that housed nothing but lies. Somewhere in the quarters, Sarah was probably holding her daughter for the last time, memorizing the weight of her, the smell of her, knowing that by tomorrow she would be gone forever. And Silas Thorne slept peacefully in his grand house, certain of his righteousness, convinced that God spoke through his mouth. Isaiah set down the plane. In the distance, the plantation bell began to toll, marking the hour, calling time like it called everything else on Eden Hill. Measured, controlled, owned. He turned his gaze back to the chapel, and the candlelight caught something cold and calculating in his eyes. "He speaks for God," Isaiah whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible above the tolling bells. "But I've only ever heard devils in his voice." 2 days after Sarah's baby vanished in the dawn wagon, a summer storm rolled across Eden Hill with the fury of something unleashed. Rain hammered the chapel roof. Wind tore branches from the old oaks and sent them tumbling across the yard like broken bones. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind shattered glass and scattered debris. Isaiah received his orders at first light. The pastor's study window had blown inward during the night. He was to repair it immediately. He gathered his tools, putty knife, glazing points, a fresh pane of glass wrapped carefully in cloth, and made his way to the main house. The building stood 3 stories tall, white columns rising from the ground like pillars in Solomon's temple. Isaiah had helped build the east wing 5 years ago. He knew every board, every nail, every place where the foundation had settled unevenly. A house servant led him upstairs to the study, then disappeared without a word. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Books lined 3 walls, their spines stamped with gold lettering Isaiah could not read, but had dusted countless times. Behind the massive desk hung a portrait of Silas in his Sunday coat, his painted eyes seeming to follow movement across the room. The broken window overlooked the chapel and the quarters beyond. Shards of glass littered the floor like fallen stars. Isaiah knelt and began collecting the larger pieces, working methodically, making no unnecessary sound. He had just started removing the remaining fragments from the frame when he heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened. Pastor Silas Thorne entered his study with the calm authority of a man entering his own cathedral. He wore dark trousers and a white shirt, his coat discarded somewhere in the summer heat. When he saw Isaiah, he nodded once, acknowledgement without warmth. "The storm was quite something," Silas said, moving to his desk. "I trust you can have this repaired by evening?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah said quietly, keeping his eyes on his work. Silas settled into his chair. He opened a leather-bound Bible, its pages edged in gold, and began to read silently. Then, as if struck by sudden inspiration, he bowed his head and began to pray aloud. "Heavenly Father, I thank you for your continued blessings upon this house. I thank you for the obedient flock you have placed under my care, for the opportunity to shepherd these souls toward righteousness." His voice carried the same resonance it held in the pulpit, as if he could not help but perform even in private. "Grant me wisdom to guide them, strength to correct them, and love to show them your divine order." Isaiah's hands continued their work, carefully fitting the new pane into place. He had learned long ago to become invisible during moments like these, to let white men's words wash over him like rain, leaving no trace. Silas finished his prayer and returned to his reading. The only sounds were the soft scrape of Isaiah's putty knife and the occasional turn of a page. Minutes passed. Isaiah had nearly completed the repair when heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. The door opened again. Jed Harlan stepped inside, his bulk filling the doorframe. The overseer was a broad-shouldered man with hands like ham hocks and a face weathered by years of outdoor cruelty. He saw Isaiah and frowned. "Pastor," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "didn't know you had company." "Just the carpenter," Silas said without looking up. "He'll be finished shortly." "What news?" Jed glanced at Isaiah, then apparently decided a slave doing repair work was no more important than furniture. About the matter we discussed yesterday. I've made the selections you requested. Silas set down his Bible. Good. Come, let's speak in the hall. They moved toward the door, but before leaving, Silas turned back. Isaiah, I'm stepping out momentarily. Continue your work. Yes, sir. The door closed behind them, but not completely. It remained open perhaps 3 inches, enough for voices to carry through. Isaiah froze with his putty knife in hand. He could retreat to the far corner, make noise to announce his presence, avoid whatever was about to be said. Instead, he remained perfectly still. So? Silas's voice came from just beyond the door. Which ones? 3 that fit your requirements, Jed said. Young, unblemished, quiet types. Got Mary from the kitchen, that girl Essie who works the vegetable garden, and the Cole girl, Ruth. Isaiah's heart stopped. Ruth Cole, Silas said thoughtfully. Isaiah's sister, yes? The one who sings during services? That's her. Pretty thing. Keeps to herself, mostly. Silence stretched for a moment. When Silas spoke again, his voice held something Isaiah had never heard before, something hungry beneath the pious words. I've been watching her, Silas said. She carries herself with a certain purity, a cleanliness of spirit that's rare among her kind. She would be suitable for spiritual cleansing. When do you want them brought to the chapel? Tomorrow evening, after supper. One at a time. Begin with Ruth. I'll prepare the ritual myself. Silas paused. This is sacred work, Jed. God grants certain men the authority to purify those in darkness. It is my burden and my blessing to carry out this holy duty. Of course, Pastor, your will is God's will. Precisely. Their footsteps moved away down the hall. Isaiah remained behind the heavy curtain where he had instinctively hidden when they began talking, his body pressed against the wall, his breathing shallow. His hands trembled so violently he had to set down his tools. Sacred rite, spiritual cleansing, purifying. The words arranged themselves into understanding, and that understanding turned his stomach to ice. He waited until he heard Silas's study door open and close again. The pastor had returned alone, carefully, silently. Isaiah gathered his tools and slipped from the room while Silas was absorbed in his Bible. No one questioned a slave leaving through the servants' stairs. The afternoon stretched into evening. Isaiah worked his regular tasks like a man moving underwater, every motion slow, every thought crystalline and terrible. When the sun finally dipped below the tree line and the work bell rang, he went directly to the quarters. He found Ruth outside her cabin, hanging washing on a line strung between 2 posts. She was humming something soft and sad, one of the old songs their mother used to sing. When she saw Isaiah's face, the humming stopped. What's wrong? He pulled her inside the cabin, away from curious eyes and listening ears. The space was barely large enough for a straw mattress and a small table, but it was theirs, the only privacy anyone in the quarters had. You have to leave, Isaiah said. Tonight. Now. Ruth's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Silas. Isaiah struggled to find words that wouldn't break her immediately. He's selected you for something he calls spiritual cleansing. He told Jed to bring you to the chapel tomorrow night. Understanding dawned slowly across Ruth's face. Her hand went to her mouth. No, she whispered. You have to run. Into the swamps. I know people who can hide you, get you further north. But you have to go now, before... I can't. Ruth, I can't. Her voice rose, then dropped to an urgent whisper. Isaiah, if I run, what do you think happens? Silas will punish everyone. He'll make an example. People will suffer because of me. People will suffer anyway. Isaiah gripped her shoulders. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. But if I stay, maybe it ends with me. Maybe I can endure it. and it'll be over, and no one else has to—" Her voice cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't have to endure anything," Isaiah said desperately. "You don't have to be sacrificed for his sickness. Please, Ruth, please." She pulled away from him and sat on the edge of her mattress, her whole body shaking. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the sounds of the quarters drifted through the thin walls. Children playing, someone chopping wood, the low murmur of conversations. Finally, Ruth looked up at him. Her face was calm now, emptied of everything except a terrible, quiet resignation. "Don't do anything rash," she said. "Promise me, Isaiah. Whatever happens, don't do anything that gets you killed. Ruth, promise me." He couldn't speak. He could only stare at his sister, at the wooden cross hanging around her neck on a frayed piece of twine, and feel something inside him begin to crack. "I have to go," Ruth said softly. "I need to pray." She stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the door. Isaiah wanted to grab her, lock her inside, anything to keep her from what was coming. But his body wouldn't move. He watched her step out into the gathering dusk, watched her walk with slow, measured steps toward the white chapel in the distance. Night fell. Crickets began their evening song. Ruth's figure grew smaller and smaller against the darkening sky, one hand clutching the wooden cross at her throat, her footsteps deliberate and fearful and utterly final. Isaiah stood in the doorway of the cabin, unable to move, unable to look away, as his sister walked toward the house of God. Midnight came with thunder. Isaiah woke to the sound, not the storm, but something beneath it. A cry that cut through the rain and darkness like a knife through flesh. His eyes snapped open. For one heartbeat he lay still, listening, praying he had imagined it. Then it came again. A scream. High and desperate and unmistakable. Ruth. He was on his feet before conscious thought took hold. The cabin door banged open. Rain lashed his face as he stumbled into the muddy path between the quarters. Lightning split the sky, turning everything white for an instant. The cabins, the fields, the distant chapel with its bell tower reaching toward God. Another scream tore through the night. Isaiah ran. His bare feet slipped in the mud. Rain soaked through his shirt in seconds. The storm swallowed all other sounds except the thunder and his own ragged breathing. He ran past the cotton gin, past the equipment shed, through the garden where Ruth had worked just yesterday. The chapel loomed ahead, its white walls gleaming wet in the darkness. "Ruth!" Her name ripped from his throat. He crashed into the chapel yard. The building stood silent now except for the rain drumming against its roof. Lamplight flickered in the windows. Isaiah threw himself at the door and grabbed the handle. Locked. "Open this door!" He pounded with both fists. "Ruth! Ruth!" From inside, muffled sounds, movement, then silence again. Isaiah slammed his shoulder against the door. The wood held firm. He stepped back and kicked. Once, twice. Nothing. He was raising his foot for another attempt when heavy footsteps splashed through the mud behind him. "Boy, you've lost your mind." Isaiah spun. Jed Harlan stood 10 feet away, rain streaming off his hat brim. In his hands, he carried a rifle. "Get away from that door," Jed said. "My sister's in there. I heard her." I said, "Get away from the door." Isaiah didn't move. His chest heaved. Water ran into his eyes. Inside the chapel, he could hear nothing now but rain and his own thundering heart. "Let her out," Isaiah said. His voice came out steady, despite everything breaking inside him. "Whatever he's doing to her, make him stop." Jed's face hardened. "The pastor is conducting sacred business. Ain't your concern. She belongs to Pastor Thorne. Same as you. Same as everyone on this land. Now step back before I make you." Isaiah looked at the rifle, looked at the locked door, looked at Jed's face and saw nothing there but cold obedience. For one wild moment, he considered rushing the man, taking the gun, shooting the lock off the door. But Jed was twice his size and armed, and Isaiah would be dead before his hand touched the barrel. Lightning flashed. Thunder rolled across the fields. The chapel door opened. Pastor Silas Thorne stepped into the rain. His shirt hung open and torn. Scratches marked his neck. His hair, usually so carefully combed, fell across his forehead in wet strands. He looked at Isaiah with eyes that held no recognition, as if the man before him was nothing more than a post or a stone. "Deliver me from the workers of iniquity," Silas said softly, "and save me from bloody men." His voice carried the same measured cadence it held during sermons. He smoothed his shirt with trembling fingers. "The purging of sin is painful work, Jed, but necessary, always necessary." "Yes, Pastor." This one tried to interrupt God's work. Silas's gaze finally focused on Isaiah. "Such defiance cannot be tolerated. Drag him to the whipping post. 20 lashes at dawn, so all may witness what happens to those who raise their hand against the Lord's servant." "No!" Isaiah lunged forward. Jed swung the rifle. The wooden stock caught Isaiah across the temple. White light exploded behind his eyes. He went down hard in the mud, tasting blood and rain. Hands grabbed him, Jed's massive hands, and hauled him upright. His vision swam. "Ruth," he tried to say, but the word came out broken. Silas was already walking back into the chapel. Before the door closed, Isaiah caught a glimpse of the interior. Overturned benches, scattered hymnals, and something small and wooden lying broken on the floor. Ruth's cross. Then the door shut. The lock clicked home. Jed dragged Isaiah away through the storm. Dawn came gray and hateful. They tied Isaiah to the whipping post in the center of the quarters. Everyone was made to watch, children and elders, field workers and house servants. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained low and threatening. Silas stood on a raised platform, Bible in hand, and delivered his sermon to the assembled crowd. "Discipline," he said, his voice carrying across the mud and misery, "is divine mercy in its truest form. When a father corrects his child, is it cruelty? No, it is love. Love that guides the wandering soul back to righteousness." He opened the Bible, though Isaiah suspected he wasn't reading from it. "The Lord disciplines those he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. We must accept this truth with grateful hearts." Isaiah hung from the post, his wrists bound above his head. He stared at the ground and said nothing. "This man," Silas continued, gesturing toward Isaiah, "raised his voice and his hand against God's appointed shepherd. He sought to interfere with sacred work. Such rebellion cannot stand. But this punishment is not revenge. It is correction. It is the firm hand of a loving father, teaching obedience through necessary pain." He nodded to Jed. The whip cracked. Pain exploded across Isaiah's back. He bit down on his tongue to keep from crying out. The taste of blood filled his mouth. The whip fell again and again. Each strike tore through flesh, opening wounds that would scar deep. Isaiah stopped counting after 10. The world became nothing but white-hot agony and the sound of leather against skin. When it finally ended, they cut him down. He collapsed in the dirt. Somewhere far away, Silas was still talking about mercy and grace and God's perfect order. Isaiah couldn't hear the words anymore. Everything had narrowed to the fire burning across his shredded back, and the single thought that repeated in his mind like a prayer. She screamed. Ruth screamed, and I couldn't save her. They left him in the field. The sun climbed higher, baking the mud and turning the air thick and suffocating. Flies found Isaiah's wounds. Fever took hold by midday. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes seeing Ruth's face, sometimes hearing her voice singing the old songs. Once he dreamed their mother came to him, telling him to rest, telling him everything would be fine. But nothing was fine. Nothing would ever be fine again. The sun set. Darkness returned. Isaiah's fever broke enough for him to think clearly, and the clarity brought only poison. He lay in the field and stared at the stars appearing one by one overhead. The same stars that had shone the night Ruth walked to the chapel. The same stars that had watched while Silas did his sacred work. If God lived in those stars, Isaiah decided, then God was as cruel as any master. His faith died with the evening light. That night, when the quarters had gone quiet and the plantation slept, Isaiah forced himself to stand. Every movement sent fresh pain screaming through his torn back. He didn't care. Pain was all he had left. Pain and the cold clarity of purpose. He limped toward the barn, staying in shadows. The moon hung fat and silver above Eden Hill, illuminating everything in pale light. Isaiah moved like a ghost through his own land, past the fields he had worked, past the chapel where his sister had screamed. Inside the barn, he found what he needed. A flask of lamp oil, kept for lanterns. His hands shook as he unstoppered it. The smell was sharp and clean. Through the barn door he could see the chapel. Its white walls gleamed in the moonlight. Its bell tower reached toward heaven, like a finger pointing at God. The chapel bell began to toll. Midnight. 12 deep notes that rolled across the plantation, calling the hour. Isaiah walked toward the sound. Each step was agony. Each step brought him closer. The oil sloshed in the flask. In his other hand, he carried a wooden match. He stopped at the base of the chapel steps. The building loomed above him, pristine, perfect, holy. Inside these walls, Silas preached about love and mercy. Inside these walls, Ruth had screamed, "Let the Lord see his own work burn," Isaiah whispered. He struck the match. The flame caught, small and bright and final. For one moment he stared at it, watching the fire dance in the darkness. Then he touched it to the oil-soaked rag he had tied around the base of the chapel door. The flame spread, fast, hungry. It climbed the wood like something alive, reaching for the roof, for the walls, for everything Pastor Silas Thorne had built on blood and scripture and lies. Isaiah stepped back and watched Eden Hill erupt into fire. The fire raged through the night like judgment incarnate. Isaiah stood at the tree line, hidden among cypress and moss, watching Eden Hill burn. The chapel went first, its white walls blackening, its bell tower collapsing inward with a sound like thunder. Sparks climbed into the sky, dancing among stars that seemed suddenly small and distant. The flames spread to the main house next, licking up the columns of the grand porch where Silas had taken his morning coffee and read his Bible. The curtains caught. The windows exploded outward in bursts of glass and heat. Then the fields. Acres of cotton, ready for harvest, became an ocean of fire. The flames moved fast through the dry stalks, feeding on months of labor and sweat and blood. Isaiah could feel the heat from where he stood, could smell the smoke mixing with the thick Louisiana air. His eyes reflected the inferno, twin mirrors of destruction that showed no tears, no regret, only the cold satisfaction of watching everything burn. People came running from the quarters. They formed lines with buckets, trying to save what could be saved, but the fire was too big, too hungry. It consumed everything Silas Thorne had built on the backs of others. Isaiah watched them fight the flames and felt nothing. Let it all burn. Let every plank of wood and bale of cotton turn to ash. Movement near the collapsing house caught his eye. A figure stumbled from the smoke. Pastor Silas Thorne, his white nightshirt torn and blackened, clutching his left arm against his chest. Even from this distance, Isaiah could see the burns marking Silas's skin, could see how he staggered and fell to his knees in the dirt. For one wild moment, Isaiah hoped the flames would reach back and claim him, pull him into the fire he deserved. But men rushed forward. They lifted Silas up, carried him away from the destruction, laid him on the grass, while someone ran for water and bandages. Isaiah watched it all with teeth clenched so tight his jaw ached. The bastard survived. As dawn broke gray and smoke stained over the ruins, Isaiah finally turned away. He moved deeper into the swamps, following paths only the enslaved knew, trails through water and undergrowth that led away from Eden Hill and everything it represented. His back still ached from the whipping. His hands still smelled like lamp oil, but he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that staying meant death. By the next morning, word had spread across the parish like wildfire of its own kind. Isaiah heard the news from a field hand passing through the swamp on his way to another plantation. The man spoke in hushed, frightened tones about what people were saying in town, how Eden Hill had fallen in the night, how the largest plantation in the county had been reduced to smoking ruins. The white townsfolk gathered at the remains, picking through ash and debris, calling it God's punishment for some hidden sin. But Silas had his own story to tell. The preacher gave a sermon that morning amid the ashes, his left arm bandaged from wrist to shoulder, his voice trembling with what listeners took for holy grief, but Isaiah recognized as rage. Silas stood on the scorched steps where his chapel had been and spoke of Satan walking among the slaves. He described how the devil had taken human form, had lived and worked, and waited for the perfect moment to strike at righteousness. "I saw him," Silas proclaimed, pointing with his good arm toward the quarters. "Isaiah Cole, a man I trusted, a man I tried to save with the word of God. But the devil's hand was upon him, and he brought this destruction to punish my faith." The crowd murmured. Some wept. Others looked toward the remaining quarters with newly fearful eyes. Silas named Isaiah as the architect of Eden Hill's fall, put a price on his head, promised reward to anyone who brought the devil's servant back in chains. News reached Isaiah through whispered network. Messages passed from plantation to plantation, carried by those who knew the old paths and secret languages. They told him about the manhunt forming, about the dogs being readied, about how Silas, despite his burns, rode from plantation to plantation, gathering men and weapons. So Isaiah went deeper into the swamps, and he wasn't alone. Others joined him in the days after the fire, people who had fled Eden Hill when the flames started, or who ran when they heard Isaiah's name being cursed from every white mouth in the parish. They gathered in a makeshift camp built on solid ground, hidden among the cypress trees, where the water ran dark as coffee and mosquitoes sang their endless songs. One of those who came was Nora Bennett. She appeared on the third day, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather bag that held her midwife tools. Nora was a woman in her 40s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. She had worked in Silas's household for years before being sent to the fields for some unnamed offense. Now she sat across from Isaiah at their small fire, roasting a fish caught from the river. "You really did it," she said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. Isaiah nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd failed to do, sat heavy in his chest. "They're saying you're possessed by demons," Nora continued. She turned the fish over the flames. "Saying you spoke in tongues and burned the chapel with hellfire. I used lamp oil and a match. I know. But the truth don't matter much when the lies sound holier." They ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the swamp. Frogs calling, water moving, other refugees moving through camp. There were maybe 15 of them now, all living on roots and river water, sleeping in crude shelters made from branches and moss. It wasn't freedom. It was survival. Barely. As darkness fell, Isaiah watched smoke still rising on the horizon where Eden Hill had been. The embers would burn for days, he knew. Weeks, maybe. Everything reduced to ash and memory. I thought I'd killed him, Isaiah said quietly. Nora looked at him across the dying fire. Her expression held no judgment, only a tired understanding born from years of witnessing Silas's cruelty. "The fire don't end until the preacher's lies do," she replied softly. A week passed in the swamps like a fever dream. Days blurred together in the humid darkness beneath the cypress canopy. The refugees learned to move silently through water, to hide their tracks, to recognize the sound of approaching danger. They survived on fish and wild greens, on rainwater collected in hollowed logs, on the desperate hope that tomorrow wouldn't bring the dogs. Isaiah's hands healed slowly from the burns he'd gotten setting the fire. The skin on his palms blistered and peeled, revealing raw pink flesh underneath. Nora treated the wounds with a paste made from mud and herbs, wrapping them in strips torn from her dress. She worked in silence, her practiced fingers gentle despite the roughness of the materials. "You'll have scars," she said one morning as she changed his bandages. "Good," Isaiah replied. "I want to remember." While Isaiah healed, news filtered into their camp from the outside world. Field hands passing through the swamps brought whispers and rumors, pieces of information gathered from other plantations. A washwoman shared what she'd overheard at the market. A stable boy repeated conversations he'd heard while tending horses. The stories all centered on the same man. Pastor Silas Thorne had recovered in a nearby town, taken in by a wealthy planter family who considered it their Christian duty to shelter God's wounded servant. Doctors tended his burns. Women from the church brought meals and prayed at his bedside. And Silas, ever the performer, turned his suffering into something holy. He called himself a chosen survivor of divine wrath. The bandaged arm became his prop, his symbol of God's testing. He wore it like a badge of honor, letting the white gauze peek from beneath his sleeve during prayer meetings. When people asked about the pain, he smiled beatifically and quoted scripture about trials and tribulation. He spoke of the fire as if it had been sent to purify him, to prepare him for some greater purpose. The newspapers ate it up. Headlines appeared in parishes across Louisiana. "The pastor who survived hellfire. God's chosen emerges from flames. Divine providence saves righteous minister." Each article painted Silas as a martyr, a man tested by Satan's rage and found worthy. They described how he'd crawled from the burning chapel with his flesh searing, how he'd watched his life's work crumble to ash, how he'd fallen to his knees and thanked God for sparing him to continue his work. Not one mentioned Ruth. Not one asked about the screams that had echoed from the chapel that night. Not one questioned why the doors had been locked from the outside. History was being written by the survivors who could write. And Isaiah's sister became nothing but smoke and forgotten memory. But Silas wasn't content with mere survival. His influence grew like kudzu, spreading through the white community with frightening speed. He began organizing what he called a revival crusade, a movement to restore godly order to the region. He rallied plantation owners with sermons about moral decay and divine punishment. He warned that Satan had infiltrated their very households through the enslaved population, that wickedness walked among them disguised as obedience. "We must be vigilant," Silas preached from temporary pulpits in town halls and barn churches. "We must root out the evil before it spreads like the fire that consumed Eden Hill." The planters listened. They organized patrols. They tightened restrictions. They watched their slaves with newly suspicious eyes. And they sent men into the swamps. Isaiah first learned about the patrols when Thomas arrived at camp one evening, his face pale with fear. Thomas had been a field hand at a neighboring plantation, who'd run when his master started talking about inspections and purges. He'd nearly been caught twice on his way to the refuge. "They're everywhere," Thomas said, accepting a cup of river water with shaking hands. Got dogs, got guns. They're checking every hollow tree, every abandoned shack, saying they're looking for the devil's servants, the ones who burned Eden Hill. Isaiah felt ice settle in his stomach. The swamps had seemed vast enough to hide in forever, but forever was shrinking fast. With organized patrols combing the woods systematically, it was only a matter of time before they found the camp. "How many have they caught?" Nora asked. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They're taking them back in chains, putting them in pens until they can figure out who was involved with the fire and who was just running." Thomas looked at Isaiah. "They're asking about you specifically, offering rewards." The camp fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. Rewards brought betrayal. Hunger and desperation made people do desperate things. That night, as the others slept fitfully in their shelters, Isaiah sat by the dying embers of the fire. Nora joined him, moving quietly through the darkness. She'd been watching him all evening, studying him with those knowing eyes. "You're planning something," she said. "Not a question. We can't stay here. The patrols are closing in, and we can't run forever." Nora settled beside him, her joints cracking softly. "Sooner or later, they'll find us, or we'll starve. Running bought us time, but time's running out." Isaiah stared at the coals, watching them pulse red in the darkness. His bandaged hands rested on his knees. The scars beneath the wrappings pulled tight when he flexed his fingers. "Then we need to change the game," he said quietly. Nora waited. She'd learned that Isaiah thought before he spoke, that his silences contained whole conversations. "Silas is building his crusade on lies," Isaiah continued, "on this image of himself as God's chosen survivor, as a righteous man tested and found worthy. People believe him because they want to believe, because the truth is too ugly to look at. The truth usually is, what if we could prove the lies? Show everyone exactly what kind of man Silas really is?" Nora's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful. "You mean expose him? I mean destroy him. Not with fire this time, with truth." The older woman considered this. Around them, the swamp sang its night songs, insects and frogs and things moving through water. Beyond the trees, somewhere in the darkness, patrols were searching for fugitives to drag back to bondage. "There might be a way," Nora said slowly. She reached into her leather bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in oilcloth. "I took this from the house before I ran the first time, before Silas sent me to the fields." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a brass key. "What's that open?" Isaiah asked. "The lockbox under the chapel pulpit, where Silas kept his private records." Nora turned the key in her fingers, letting firelight catch on the metal. "He thought nobody knew about it, but I cleaned that chapel for 3 years. I saw him put things in there when he thought he was alone." "What kind of things?" "A ledger. Pages and pages of names and numbers. Every person he sold, every deal he made, every dollar of tithe money that went into his pocket instead of the church coffers." Nora's voice hardened. Records of everything he wanted hidden. Proof of who he really was beneath all that scripture and sanctimony. Isaiah felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly. That had died with Ruth. But something like purpose. A clear path forward through the darkness. "If we could get that ledger," he said carefully, "if we could show people what he really did with God's money and God's children, his whole empire would crumble. All those planters funding his crusade would turn on him. The newspapers would tear him apart. He'd be ruined. Completely." They sat in silence, both understanding the weight of what they were considering. Going back to Eden Hill meant risking everything. The ruins would be watched. Patrols would be heaviest there. And even if the ledger survived the fire, finding it among the ashes seemed impossible. Lightning flashed on the horizon, illuminating the swamp in brief, stark clarity. Thunder followed seconds later. a low rumble that promised rain. Isaiah watched the storm approach, thinking about fire and water, about destruction and revelation, about how some things needed to burn before truth could emerge from the ashes. He stood slowly, his body stiff from days of sleeping on the ground. The bandages on his hands felt tight. His back still ached where Silas's whip had torn the flesh. But none of that mattered anymore. Pain was just another language now, another way of speaking truth. Nora rose beside him, tucking the key back into her bag. She understood before he spoke. She'd seen that look in his eyes, the cold clarity of purpose that came when a man stopped running and started hunting. Isaiah stared toward the direction of Eden Hill's ruins, toward the place where his sister had died, and his faith had burned, and everything had ended so it could begin again. The storm was moving closer. Rain would come soon, washing tracks away, covering sounds, making the night darker and more dangerous. Perfect conditions for what needed doing. "Then we go back," Isaiah said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. This time, for his soul. The ruins of Eden Hill looked like a mouthful of broken teeth under the quarter moon. Charred timbers jutted from the earth at wrong angles. The smell of old smoke still clung to everything, thick and acrid, mixing with the damp rot of spring growth trying to reclaim the burned ground. Isaiah crouched at the tree line, studying the landscape of destruction. 3 nights had passed since he'd made his decision. 3 nights of watching patrol patterns, learning guard rotations, waiting for the right moment. Beside him, Nora adjusted the sack on her shoulder, her breath coming slow and steady despite her age. "The chapel's that way," she whispered, pointing toward a collapsed structure near what remained of the main house. "If the ledger survived, it'll be under the pulpit still. Silas built that lockbox from iron and stone." They moved through the darkness like shadows. Isaiah's feet remembered the paths between the quarters, even though the buildings were gone. He'd walked these routes 1,000 times, carrying tools, hauling wood, moving through his prison with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to leave no trace. The chapel ruins rose before them. The walls had collapsed inward, creating a skeletal framework of blackened beams and scattered stone. The steeple had fallen straight down, crushing the front pews into splinters. But the pulpit area, built on a raised platform of brick and mortar, remained partially intact. They climbed over debris carefully. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness, the scrape of boot on stone, the crack of charred wood beneath their weight. The air tasted of ash. Isaiah's throat tightened as they passed through what had been the chapel doorway. Ruth had walked through here, had screamed in here, had died in here while he'd been too broken and too late to save her. "Focus," Nora said quietly, reading his stillness. "Grief later. Work now." They reached the pulpit platform. The lectern itself had burned completely, but the raised floor remained. Nora knelt and began brushing away debris with her hands, searching for the seams she remembered. Isaiah helped, moving chunks of blackened wood and broken stone. "Here," Nora said. Her fingers traced a rectangular outline in the brick. "Help me lift." Together they pried at the edges. The bricks were mortared tight, but the fire's heat had weakened the bonds. Isaiah wedged a piece of iron rebar into the gap and levered upward. The bricks shifted, lifted, came free with a grinding scrape. Beneath them lay an iron box, its surface scorched but intact. Nora pulled out her key with trembling hands. The lock was stiff with heat damage, but after several attempts, it turned. The lid opened with a metallic shriek that seemed impossibly loud in the night silence. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, lay a leather-bound ledger. Isaiah lifted it out carefully. The edges were singed, but the bulk remained readable. He opened to a random page and saw names written in Silas's precise handwriting. Names of people, ages, prices, dates of sale. Sarah, age 16, sold to Beaumont Plantation for $800. Thomas, age 12, sold to Mississippi trader for $650. Ruth Cole? Isaiah's hands stopped. He stared at his sister's name, written in the same cold precision as all the others. Beside it were notes in smaller script. Selected for spiritual purification. Resistance noted. Disciplinary measures required. The ledger shook in his grip. Nora touched his arm gently. "We need to move," she said. "We got what we came for." Isaiah closed the book, tucking it inside his shirt. The leather felt warm against his skin. They climbed down from the platform and started back through the ruins. They'd made it halfway to the tree line when a voice cut through the darkness. "Well, well. Look what crawled back to the scene of the crime." Deputy Elias Sloan stepped from behind a collapsed wall, revolver raised. The moonlight caught on his badge, polished bright despite the late hour. He smiled, the expression carrying no warmth at all. "Isaiah Cole, you made this mighty easy for me. Rewards are doubled now, you know. Pastor Thorne wants you bad." Isaiah's mind raced. The deputy stood between them and the trees. Behind them lay only open ground and the river beyond the cemetery. No cover, no escape in that direction. "Run," Nora whispered. "The graveyard." They bolted. Sloane's gun cracked once, the bullet singing past Isaiah's ear. He ran through the chapel ruins, Nora beside him, heading for the small cemetery where the white folks of Eden Hill had buried their dead for 3 generations. Headstones rose like crooked fingers from the ground. They wove between them, using the monuments for cover. Sloane followed, cursing as he stumbled over the uneven ground. "Can't run forever," the deputy called. "Swamp's full of my men. Got nowhere to go but hell." Isaiah ducked behind a large marble cross, marking some planter's eternal rest. Nora pressed against the stone beside him, breathing hard. Her bag had fallen open. Among the herbs and rags, he saw a broken piece of wood, part of a chapel beam, one end splintered to a sharp point. Sloane's boots crunched closer. He was moving methodically between the graves, checking each potential hiding spot. His revolver gleamed in the moonlight. "Here's how this works," Sloane said conversationally. "You come out peaceful. I take you in alive. You make me work for it. I shoot you and collect the reward anyway. Pastor don't care which, long as you're caught." Nora met Isaiah's eyes. Her face was calm, resolved. She picked up the splintered beam, testing its weight. Then she stood and stepped into the open. "Over here, deputy." Sloane spun, raising his gun. "Well now, the witch herself. That's 2 rewards in 1. Nora moved faster than her age suggested possible. She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and drove the splintered wood into Sloane's throat, just above the collar. The deputy made a wet, choking sound. His gun discharged into the ground. He fell backward, clutching at the wooden spike, blood pouring black in the moonlight. Isaiah stood frozen, watching the deputy thrash and die among the headstones. Nora pulled the bloody spike free and let it fall. "We need to go," she said simply. "Now." They ran for the tree line, leaving Sloane's body among the graves. Behind them, voices called out. Other patrol members responding to the gunshot. But the darkness swallowed Isaiah and Nora before anyone else arrived. They didn't stop running until they reached the river, miles from Eden Hill's ruins. There they collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for air. Isaiah pulled the ledger from his shirt, checking that it remained undamaged. The pages were intact. The proof was safe. Nora sat beside him, washing Sloane's blood from her hands in the river water. Her face looked ancient in the pre-dawn light, lined with years of service and survival, and choices that left permanent marks. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "About Silas. About why I know his sins so deeply." Isaiah waited, listening to the river's constant voice. "I served in his house for years, cleaned his study, prepared his meals, saw things I wasn't supposed to see." Nora's hands stilled in the water. He fathered a child with a woman named Grace, a girl with his eyes and his chin. When she turned 5, when people started noticing the resemblance, he sold her north, told Grace it was God's will that they be separated. That morning, he preached a sermon about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Where did the child go? New York. Sold to a trader heading to the factories. I have her name written down. Mary Grace Thorne, though she'll never know that surname. Nora looked at Isaiah. That's the man we're fighting, one who'd sell his own blood to preserve his reputation. Isaiah felt something cold and clear settle in his chest. Not rage anymore, something colder, more precise. Then we make sure everyone knows, he said. Every truth, every sin, every child sold, and every lie told. As dawn broke over the river, turning the water from black to silver, Isaiah pulled out a scrap of paper and a pencil stub he'd stolen weeks ago. He studied the ledger's handwriting, Silas's distinctive script with its flourishes and precise spacing. Then he began to write, matching the curves and loops exactly. I, Silas Thorne, servant of gold and not God, confess my sins before heaven and earth. The words flowed like poison onto the page. Isaiah wrote about the sales and the sermons, about the locked chapel doors and the screams that went unanswered, about children sold and scripture twisted to justify greed. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully. He pressed his thumb into the river mud and marked the paper with ash from his burned hands, a seal of earth and fire. First of many? Nora asked. First of many, Isaiah confirmed. The letters spread like fever. Isaiah and Nora worked from their swamp camp, copying Silas's handwriting onto stolen paper. Each confession was slightly different, enough variation to seem authentic, each one revealing another layer of the pastor's corruption. They left the letters in church collection boxes, under the doors of rival ministers, tucked into newspapers at general stores. Anonymous truth spreading through the white parishes like rot through timber. Within 2 weeks, the whispers began. Isaiah heard them when he snuck into town for supplies, moving through the colored quarters where gossip flowed freely between houses. The white folks were talking. Pastors in neighboring parishes had received letters bearing Silas Thorne's signature, confessing to doctored miracles and embezzled tithes. One letter detailed how Silas had staged his own divine visions using laudanum and theater tricks learned from a traveling showman. Another listed mistresses by name and the hush money paid to their families. The letters never mentioned the enslaved directly. That would have been dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. Instead, they spoke in the language white society understood: financial corruption, sexual scandal, pride disguised as piety, the kind of sins that turned congregations against their shepherds. It's working, Nora said one evening as they huddled around a small fire deep in the cypress swamps. She was mending a torn shirt, her needle moving with practiced efficiency. My cousin works in Baton Rouge. Says 2 churches have asked Silas to explain himself in writing. Isaiah studied the ledger by firelight, copying another page into their record. It won't be enough. They'll defend him. White folks always protect their own. Maybe, Nora allowed. But doubt is a hungry thing. Once it starts eating, it doesn't stop until there's nothing left. She was right about doubt, but she was wrong about protection. 3 days later, the raids began. Silas's response was swift and brutal. If whispers questioned his divinity, he would prove his power through force. He convinced the parish authorities that the swamps harbored not just fugitives, but practitioners of dark magic, witches and conjurers poisoning Christian society with their presence. The first raid hit a small settlement of free-colored families living on the parish edge. Deputies tore through homes, searching for evidence of witchcraft. They found herb bundles used for medicine, bones from healing rituals, anything that could be twisted into proof of devil worship. 5 people were arrested. 2 were hanged within a week. The raids spread deeper into the swamps. Patrol groups moved through the wetlands, burning camps and capturing anyone who couldn't prove their free status. The fugitive communities scattered like startled birds, fleeing deeper into the wilderness or north toward uncertain freedom. Isaiah and Nora moved camp every 2 days, staying ahead of the patrols. But Nora's skills as a midwife made her vulnerable. People knew her, needed her. When word came that a child had been shot during a raid in a nearby village, a settlement just outside the swamp's deepest reaches, Nora insisted on going. "They'll catch you," Isaiah said. "This could be a trap." "It's a child," Nora replied, packing her medical supplies. "Bleeding child don't care about traps." "Then I'll come with you." "No." She met his eyes firmly. "You're the one they want most. The letters need to continue. If I'm caught, you keep writing. Promise me." Isaiah wanted to argue, but he saw the steel in her expression, the same strength that had driven the spike into Sloane's throat, that had survived decades of service to Silas Thorne without breaking. He nodded slowly. "I promise." Nora left at dusk. Isaiah waited at the camp, maintaining the fire, trying not to count the hours. She'd said she would return by dawn. Dawn came and went. The morning stretched into afternoon, and still no sign of her. Isaiah knew before the runner arrived. He felt it in his chest, a hollowness that had nothing to do with hunger. The runner was a young boy, maybe 12, who worked in the village kitchens. He found Isaiah's camp and delivered the news in a breathless whisper. They caught her, the midwife. Deputies were waiting at the house. They took her to the chapel ruins. Pastor Thorne's there now, calling it a trial. Isaiah grabbed his knife and started walking. The boy caught his arm. "You can't go. They'll kill you. Then they'll kill me." Isaiah pulled free and headed toward Eden Hill. He approached from the north, climbing the wooded hill that overlooked the plantation ruins. From there, hidden in the tree line, he could see everything without being seen. A crowd had gathered, maybe 200 people, white and colored both, standing in a rough circle around the chapel foundation. In the center stood a gallows, hastily built but sturdy enough for its purpose, and beside it stood Silas Thorne. The pastor had recovered fully from his burns. His arm still bore scars, visible where his sleeve was rolled back, but he moved with the same commanding presence that had once filled his pulpit. He wore black today, funeral clothes, and his voice carried across the ruins with practiced projection. "This woman," Silas declared, gesturing to Nora where she stood bound between 2 deputies, "has confessed to witchcraft, to poisoning the minds of good Christian folk with lies and slander. She admits to writing false letters bearing my name, attempting to corrupt our faith with Satan's whispers." Isaiah's hands clenched. They'd tortured a confession from her. Of course they had. "But I am merciful," Silas continued, "as God is merciful. I offer her one chance at redemption. Recant her sins, name her accomplices, and be granted a quick death. Refuse, and face the rope with Satan's mark upon her soul." The crowd murmured. Some looked uncomfortable. Others nodded with righteous certainty. Isaiah recognized several faces, people who'd knelt in Silas's chapel, who'd praised his sermons, who'd called Eden Hill blessed ground. Nora stood straight, despite the ropes binding her wrists. Her dress was torn and bloodied, her face swollen from beatings, but her eyes remained clear. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I have nothing to recant. Every word I wrote was truth. Every letter bore witness to crimes this man committed in God's name. He is no pastor. He is a thief and a murderer who wrapped himself in Scripture to hide his sins." The crowd gasped. Silas's smile never wavered. "The devil speaks through her," he said sadly. "We have our answer." The deputies dragged Nora toward the gallows. She didn't resist. They placed the noose around her neck, pulling the knot tight. The crowd pressed closer, some eager to witness judgment, others simply trapped by the mass of bodies. Isaiah started to rise, to run down the hill, to do something, but stopped. A dozen armed men surrounded the gallows. He'd be dead before he reached her, and then the letters would stop. The truth would die with them both. He forced himself to remain still, to watch, to bear witness. The deputy kicked the stool away. Nora's body dropped. The rope snapped taut. But even as she swung, choking, dying, her lips moved. Isaiah couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he saw them form. And then Nora's voice rose one final time, loud enough to carry across the ruins. "The truth will burn louder than fire!" Thunder rolled across the sky. The crowd looked up as the first raindrops began to fall. Silas smiled. He looked directly at the hillside where Isaiah hid, as if he knew exactly where to find him. The pastor raised one hand toward the darkening sky in a gesture of benediction. "Let God's rain wash clean this tainted ground," Silas intoned. Nora's body swung in the growing wind. The crowd began to disperse, people pulling shawls and hats over their heads as the rain intensified. Within minutes, only Silas and his deputies remained, standing beneath the storm like monuments to their own righteousness. Isaiah waited until full dark before descending the hill. The rain fell in sheets now, turning the ground to mud. He made his way to the chapel ruins, to the fresh grave they'd dug for Nora behind the old cemetery. No marker, no name, just disturbed earth already dissolving in the downpour. He knelt in the mud and dug with his bare hands until he reached soil that hadn't yet been touched by rain. He filled his fists with it, the earth that held Nora's body, the ground she'd died defending. No more words, Isaiah whispered to the storm. Only judgment. He rose, mud dripping from his hands, and began walking. Not back to the swamps. Not toward escape or safety. Toward town. Toward the new church, where Silas had begun holding services. Toward the heart of the rot that had destroyed everything he'd loved. The rain continued to fall. Behind him, Nora's grave slowly filled with water. Ahead, lights glowed in the windows of the righteous, warm and safe and completely unaware of what moved through the darkness toward them. Isaiah reached the edge of town. As dawn broke through the storm clouds, the rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving the streets slick and muddy. Water dripped from awnings and gathered in deep puddles that reflected the gray morning sky. He moved carefully between buildings, staying in the shadows. The town was beginning to wake. Shopkeepers opening shutters, women carrying wash buckets toward the river, men heading to early labor. Isaiah pulled his hat low and kept his head down, just another colored man moving through the morning. He needed to find Silas. The pastor would be at the new church building on the town square, preparing for morning prayers. Isaiah had no plan beyond confrontation. No strategy, just the truth, and his willingness to die, speaking it. He turned down Market Street, heading toward the square. That's when he heard the shouting. Ahead, near the livery stable, two white men had cornered a freedman against the wall. The freedman held his papers in trembling hands, trying to explain something. One of the white men, a slave catcher named Virgil Moss, known for his cruelty, tore the papers away and threw them into a puddle. "These could be forged," Moss said loudly. "Could be stolen. How do I know you're really free?" "I showed you the certificate," the freedman pleaded. "It's stamped by the county clerk." Moss struck him across the face with the back of his hand. The freedman stumbled but didn't fall. A small crowd began to gather, watching with the detached curiosity of people observing someone else's misfortune. Isaiah should have kept walking, should have stayed hidden, but something in him, the same thing that had driven him to light the first flame, wouldn't allow it. He stepped forward from the alley. "Leave him be," Isaiah said quietly. Moss turned, surprised. His partner, a younger man with a patchy beard, grinned. "Well now," Moss said, "And who asked for your opinion, boy?" "Those papers are legal," Isaiah continued, ignoring the slur. "You can see the stamp from here. Man's free. You got no right to lay hands on him." The freedman looked at Isaiah with wide, frightened eyes, silently begging him to stop. But Isaiah had already committed. He met Moss's gaze steadily. "You the law now?" Moss stepped closer. "You telling me what rights I got?" "I'm telling you what's true." Moss swung without warning. Isaiah dodged, but the partner grabbed him from behind, pinning his arms. Moss drove his fist into Isaiah's stomach, then his face. Isaiah tasted blood. The crowd grew larger, forming a loose circle around the violence. "This one's got no papers at all," Moss announced to the gathering crowd. "Probable runaway. Assaulting a white man in public." He turned to his partner. "Get the shackles." Isaiah didn't resist as they chained his wrists and ankles. Blood ran from his split lip down his chin. The freedman had disappeared into the crowd, papers clutched to his chest. At least that man would live to see another day. "String him up," someone in the crowd called out. "Trial first," Moss replied. "Pastor Thorne's been asking for this one special. Said there was a dangerous runaway spreading lies about Eden Hill. Fits the description perfect." They dragged Isaiah through the streets toward the courthouse. Word spread quickly. By the time they reached the square, a crowd of over 100 people had gathered. Isaiah saw their faces: excitement, righteousness, anger. They looked at him like he was already guilty, already dead. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building with white columns and a tall steeple. Inside, the main chamber had been converted into a courtroom. Benches lined both sides of a central aisle, leading to a raised platform where a judge's desk sat. Behind it, a large window looked out over the square. They chained Isaiah to a post near the front. The crowd filed in, packing the benches until people stood along the walls. Isaiah saw preachers from neighboring parishes, planters in their fine coats, poor whites who'd come for the spectacle. The air grew hot and close, with so many bodies pressed together. Then Silas entered. The pastor wore white today, a spotless suit that made him look like an angel among common men. The burn scars on his arm were visible, carefully displayed. He walked slowly down the aisle, nodding to familiar faces, his expression grave and sorrowful. He took a seat at the front, not on the judge's bench, but in a special chair placed beside it. The position of moral witness, not officially presiding, but everyone knew whose authority mattered here. Judge Carver, a portly man with thinning hair, called the court to order. The charges were read: arson, murder, theft, inciting rebellion, assault on a white man. Each accusation drew gasps and murmurs from the crowd. "How do you plead?" Judge Carver asked. Isaiah said nothing. His silence seemed to agitate the crowd more than any protest would have. Witnesses came forward. Jed Harlan testified about the night of the fire, claiming he'd seen Isaiah near the chapel with a torch. A fabrication, but no one questioned it. Deputy Sloan's widow wept on the stand, describing how her husband had died pursuing dangerous fugitives. Other plantation owners spoke about the chaos Isaiah's actions had caused, the property destroyed, the natural order disrupted. Through it all, Silas sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his expression radiating patient sorrow. Finally, Judge Carver turned to the pastor. "Reverend Thorne, you knew this man. You ministered to him. What can you tell us of his character?" Silas rose slowly. He approached Isaiah, studying him like a scientist examining a specimen. When he spoke, his voice filled the courtroom with practiced power. "This man," Silas began, "embodied the devil who tempted mankind into rebellion. I tried to save his soul. I preached to him about obedience and grace. I showed him mercy when he deserved punishment, but Satan's grip was too strong. He poisoned others with his influence, turned them against God's natural order. And when I attempted to correct him, to guide him back to righteousness. He repaid my kindness with destruction." The crowd murmured agreement. Silas continued, building momentum. The fire that consumed Eden Hill was not merely arson. It was an attack on civilization itself, on the family, on faith. This man sought to tear down everything we hold sacred, to replace divine order with chaos and violence. He is not simply a criminal. He is the physical manifestation of evil walking among us. Thunder rumbled distantly. Several people glanced toward the windows. The sky had darkened again. Judge Carver cleared his throat. "Does the accused wish to speak in his own defense?" The courtroom fell silent. Everyone waited. Isaiah had been quiet throughout the entire proceeding, his face unreadable despite the bruises and blood. Now he raised his head and met the judge's eyes. "Yes," Isaiah said. His voice was soft but clear. People leaned forward to hear. "I'll speak," Judge Carver gestured. "Then speak." Isaiah looked slowly around the courtroom. He saw the eager faces waiting for his confession or denial. He saw Silas standing confidently near the front. He saw the preachers who'd traveled here to witness justice, the planters who'd lost property in the chaos following Eden Hill's fall, the poor whites who'd come to see a devil punished. When he spoke, his voice remained calm, steady, each word chosen with the same precision he'd once used to measure wood and cut joints. "Pastor Thorne says I embodied the devil," Isaiah began. "Maybe he's right. Maybe only the devil would burn down a chapel. But let me tell you what that chapel was built on." He named the first child, Mary Johnson, sold at 6 months old to a trader heading to Mississippi, baptized one Sunday, gone by Tuesday. The congregation had wept at her blessing. No one mentioned her again after the sale. He named the second, Thomas Wright, 8 years old, sold to pay for the chapel's new bell, the same bell that called people to worship. He named the third, the fourth, the fifth. Children baptized and sold, families blessed and broken. Every transaction recorded in Silas's ledger, every profit wrapped in scripture. The courtroom stirred. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others shook their heads, refusing to believe. Isaiah continued. He spoke about the women, about Ruth and the others who disappeared into the chapel at night and emerged different, if they emerged at all. About Nora's confession regarding Silas's illegitimate child, sold north before it could speak its father's name. "Pastor Thorne preaches about God's order," Isaiah said. "But his order means children torn from mothers, women defiled in the house of God. Men and women worked until their bodies break, then replaced like tools. That's not divine. That's just cruelty with a Bible in its hand." Thunder crashed closer now. Rain began to patter against the windows. Judge Carver banged his gavel. "That's enough." But Isaiah wasn't finished. He spoke about the sermons, describing how he'd seen Silas copy other ministers' words, claiming divine inspiration while stealing from books. How the pastor's famous eloquence came not from God, but from plagiarism and practice. "Every word he speaks is borrowed or bought," Isaiah said. "Every prayer is performance. He's not a man of God. He's a merchant who found religion profitable." The courtroom erupted. Some people shouted denials. Others demanded silence. Preachers stood from their seats, faces red with anger or pale with uncertainty. The crowd became a churning mass of confusion and rage. Silas remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, he began to smile. He walked to the judge's desk and placed his hand on the Bible resting there. The gesture commanded attention. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to the pastor. "God himself," Silas declared, his voice rising above the thunder outside, "will strike down this liar." Lightning flashed through the courthouse windows. In that instant of brilliant white light, Everyone saw the steeple above them, the tall spire topped with a metal cross that reached toward the storming sky. The lightning struck. The lightning strike was instant, violent, absolute. The metal cross atop the steeple became a conductor for heaven's fury. White fire poured down the spire, through the wooden beams, into the roof structure itself. For one frozen moment, everyone in the courtroom stared upward, watching electricity dance across the ceiling. Then the screaming started. The roof beam directly above the judge's bench exploded into flame. Wood splintered with sounds like gunshots. Burning debris rained down onto the platform where Judge Carver sat. He scrambled backward, his robe catching fire. People rushed toward the exits, pushing and shoving, climbing over benches in their panic to escape. The steeple groaned. The entire structure began to shift, tilting as the lightning-struck timbers gave way. Smoke poured through the ceiling, thick and black, filling the courtroom in seconds. Isaiah couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The air became impossible to breathe. More beams fell. A section of roof crashed down onto the right side of the courtroom, crushing the benches where the preachers had been sitting. Isaiah heard screams cut short beneath the wreckage. Fire spread along the fallen timbers, racing toward the walls with hungry speed. The chain holding Isaiah to the post went slack. The post itself had cracked when debris struck it. He pulled free, his wrists still bound, but his body mobile. He dropped to his knees, where the smoke was thinnest, and began crawling toward where he remembered the exit being. Bodies pushed past him in the chaos. Someone stepped on his hand. Another person fell across his back, scrambling over him in blind terror. The heat grew intense. Sweat poured down Isaiah's face, mixing with soot and blood. His lungs burned with each breath. He crawled forward, felt wood beneath his palms, then stone, then something soft that moved. A person, unconscious or dead. He crawled past them. His bound hands made progress difficult, but he pushed himself forward with his elbows and knees, inch by inch through the smoke and chaos. Behind him, someone cried out. Not the panicked scream of the fleeing crowd, but a specific voice, calling for help, begging. Please! Someone! I'm trapped! Isaiah recognized that voice. He stopped crawling, turned his head back toward the sound. Through the shifting smoke, he saw a figure pinned beneath a massive fallen beam, the same beam that had supported the center of the roof. It lay across the man's legs, too heavy to lift alone. Pastor Silas Thorne reached toward the fleeing crowd with one desperate hand. His white suit was already stained with soot and blood. His carefully groomed hair hung wild across his face. The mask of divine authority had crumbled completely, leaving only a terrified man trapped beneath wood and fire. "Help me!" Silas screamed. "For God's sake, someone help me!" The crowd flowed past him like water around a stone. No one stopped. They were too consumed with their own survival, too desperate to reach the exits before the whole building came down. The pastor who had commanded their worship was now just another obstacle in their path to safety. Silas's eyes found Isaiah through the smoke. "You!" Silas gasped. "Isaiah, please! I'm begging you!" Isaiah stayed frozen on his hands and knees, staring at the trapped man. Fire crept closer along the fallen beam. It would reach Silas soon. Maybe minutes, maybe less. "I can't move it," Silas pleaded. His voice broke with desperation. "I can't get free. Please, you're a man of God, aren't you? You know mercy. You know forgiveness. That's what he teaches. That's what makes us different from the beasts." The smoke shifted. Isaiah could see Silas's face clearly now. Saw the fear there, raw and absolute. The pastor who'd spoken so confidently about divine will and natural order was reduced to begging a man he'd called the devil incarnate. "I'm sorry," Silas said, words tumbling out in frantic rush. "For everything. For Ruth, for the others, for what I did. I was wrong. God forgive me. I was wrong. But you can save me. You can show them mercy exists. You can prove you're better than what they said. Please, please don't leave me here. Another section of ceiling collapsed nearby. The fire roared louder, consuming oxygen, spreading across every surface it touched. The heat made Isaiah's skin feel like it was cooking. He could taste ash and smoke with every breath. Isaiah looked at Silas Thorne, really looked at him, saw the man who destroyed his faith, murdered his sister, twisted scripture into weapons, built an empire on suffering and called it holy, saw the preacher who'd stood over his whipped back and called it divine mercy, saw the monster who'd smiled while Nora swung from a rope. "You're a man of God," Silas whispered again. "Aren't you?" Isaiah's voice came out quiet, calm, each word deliberate despite the chaos around them. "I was." He turned away, dropped back to his knees, began crawling again toward the exit, leaving the pastor's screams behind him. "No! No, please! Isaiah! Come back! Don't leave me! Isaiah!" The screams followed Isaiah through the smoke. He crawled over debris, under fallen beams, past bodies he couldn't help. His bound hands made every movement agony, but he kept moving. Behind him, Silas's voice grew hoarse, then desperate, then finally faded beneath the roar of flames and collapsing wood. Isaiah's hands found the doorframe. He pulled himself through, tumbling down the courthouse steps into the street outside. Rain hit his face like a blessing. The storm that had brought the lightning now poured down in sheets, drenching everything, washing the soot from his skin. He collapsed onto the muddy ground and breathed. Just breathed. The rain filled his mouth, cool and clean after the burning air inside. Around him, survivors huddled in shocked groups, staring at the courthouse as it burned. The rain intensified. Water poured from the sky with biblical force, hammering the flames, fighting the fire that consumed the building. Steam rose where rain met fire. The courthouse roof collapsed inward, with a groan of dying timber. People whispered around Isaiah. He heard fragments of their conversations through the rain. Struck the liar. Judgment came from above. Maybe the slave was telling truth. God's hand, clear as day. Isaiah didn't care what they thought. Didn't care about their interpretations or their shifting beliefs. He crawled away from the crowd, toward the low fence that bordered the churchyard across the street. His body felt impossibly heavy. Every muscle screamed. His lungs ached with every breath. He reached the fence and collapsed against it, sat with his back to the wooden posts, facing the burning courthouse. The rain continued, gradually winning its battle against the flames. Smoke rose into the gray sky, diffusing into the storm clouds above. Dawn light began to cut through the smoke and rain, pale and weak at first, then gradually stronger. It painted everything in shades of silver and ash. The courthouse became a skeleton of blackened beams against the lightening sky. Isaiah's eyes grew heavy. Soot covered his face like a second skin, like ashes, like the residue of something burned away and something new beginning to form beneath. His breathing slowed, steadied. The rain washed over him, relentless and cleansing. His eyes closed. The rain stopped just before dawn broke fully across the Louisiana sky. The courthouse remained a smoking skeleton, its blackened beams jutting upward like the ribs of some great dead beast. Water pooled in the ruins, reflecting the pale morning light that filtered through lingering clouds of smoke and steam. People emerged from their homes as daylight strengthened. They gathered in small clusters along the street, staring at the destruction in numb silence. Some wept. Others simply stood, their faces blank with shock. The storm had passed, but it left behind a changed world. The first searchers arrived as the sun cleared the horizon. Men with tools began picking through the wreckage, calling out for survivors. finding instead only bodies. They worked slowly, reverently, pulling charred remains from beneath fallen timbers. Each discovery brought fresh cries of grief from the watching crowd. Mary Elkins arrived with the early light. She was a freedwoman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back beneath a simple cloth wrap, her dress practical and worn. She carried a canvas bag filled with bandages, herbs, and the basic tools of her trade. Her education, rare for a woman of her status, had come from years working with abolitionist networks in the North. She'd learned to treat wounds, set bones, and recognize which injuries could be healed and which could only be eased toward death. She moved through the ruins with careful steps, testing each plank before putting weight on it. The other searchers ignored her mostly. A woman with a medicine bag wasn't worth their attention when there were white victims to recover. That suited Mary fine. It let her work without interference. She found bodies. Too many. Some she recognized from town. The judge, several prominent planters, townspeople who'd come to witness what they thought would be simple justice, all reduced to burned flesh and shattered bone beneath the courthouse's collapsed weight. She found Isaiah near the eastern wall, buried beneath a section of gallery railing that had fallen and created a small pocket of protected space. She almost missed him. His body was so covered in soot and ash that he blended with the debris. But she saw his hand, fingers slightly curled, and noticed the faint rise and fall of breathing. Mary dropped to her knees beside him and pressed her fingers to his neck. His pulse beat steady beneath her touch, strong despite everything. She carefully shifted the debris covering him, moving each piece with deliberate care to avoid causing further injury. The railing had likely saved his life, creating a shelter when the roof collapsed around him. His wrists showed deep bruising from shackles. His back bore the marks of recent whipping, the wounds infected and weeping. His left leg bent at an angle that made Mary's stomach turn. Broken, certainly, possibly shattered beyond repair. But he was alive. She worked quickly, splinting the leg with boards from the wreckage and strips torn from her own petticoat. She cleaned what wounds she could with water from her canteen, applied poultices of herbs to fight infection, wrapped his ribs where they showed signs of cracking. All the while, Isaiah remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but regular. "Found someone living over here," Mary called out to the other searchers. None came to help. She didn't call again. Instead, she flagged down two men who were clearing debris from the street. Together, they fashioned a crude stretcher from boards and canvas. They lifted Isaiah as gently as possible, though even careful movement made him groan in unconscious pain. They carried him to Mary's small house at the edge of town, a freedwoman's property that existed in that uncertain space between black and white worlds. She tended him there for days, changed his bandages, spooned broth between his lips when fever made him delirious, sat beside his bedside through the nights when his breathing grew labored and uncertain. Slowly, gradually, his body began to heal. While Isaiah fought his private battle with death, the town wrestled with what had happened. People talked in hushed voices about omens and signs. The things they found in the courthouse ruins seemed impossible, yet undeniable. The judge's Bible, which he'd kept on his bench for 40 years, had burned completely. Not a single page remained. Yet the ledger of court proceedings beside it survived untouched. The large crucifix that hung behind the judge's seat had melted. The metal had run like water, pooling on the floor in a shape that looked disturbingly like a serpent. Most disturbing of all were the sermons. Pastor Silas Thorne's body had been recovered from the ruins, crushed beneath the same beam that pinned him. Clutched in his burned hand were papers, pages from his own sermons, charred at the edges but still readable. The words visible spoke of obedience, natural order, divine hierarchy, all the justifications he'd used to build his empire. People whispered that God himself had struck the pastor down, that heaven's judgment had come not for the chained slave, but for the man who claimed to speak with God's voice. The whispers grew louder. They spread through town, then to neighboring parishes, carried by travelers and traders who'd witnessed the trial and the lightning strike. Within a week, the story had transformed. Pastor Silas Thorne, once called God's hand on earth, became a cautionary tale, a false prophet struck down by divine fire. The slave he'd condemned became something else, a vessel of truth, perhaps, or simply a man who'd survived what heaven itself had judged worthy of destruction. Mary listened to these stories with careful neutrality. She'd learned long ago that white folks' interpretations of God's will shifted with their convenience. What mattered to her was the man healing in her back room, the slow return of strength to his broken body. Isaiah woke on the seventh day. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light filtering through Mary's small window. He tried to speak, but managed only a croak. Mary brought him water, held the cup to his lips while he drank. "Easy," she said softly. "You've been through hell and back." His lips moved. After several attempts, words came. "Where?" "My home. You're safe here." He closed his eyes, processing this. When they opened again, they held question. "The pastor?" he whispered. "Dead. Burned in the courthouse." Mary paused. "They're saying God struck him down for his lies." Something flickered across Isaiah's face. Not quite satisfaction, not quite grief. Something more complex than either emotion alone. "The others?" he asked. "Some lived. Most didn't." Mary dampened a cloth and wiped his face gently. "You need rest. We can talk more when you're stronger." Over the following weeks, Isaiah's body mended. The leg would never be quite right. He'd walk with a limp for the rest of his days. But he walked. His ribs healed. The infection in his back wounds cleared. Mary's careful nursing brought him back from death's edge. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.